Hello, hello, hello. Welcome everybody to today's Givebutter webinar. If you're looking for how to increase LGBT donors and board members, hey, good news, you came to the right place. We are going to play a little bit of music while everybody continues to roll in. And in the meantime, we'd love to know where everyone is Zooming from today. So drop your location and let us know. We'll see you all in a couple of minutes. Hello, hello, everybody. Welcome again to today's Givebutter webinar, streaming to you live from Kalamazoo. I'm your host, Rachel Mills. In today's webinar, we have a very special guest here with us, Brian from Parkes Philanthropy, an experienced fundraiser in the LGBT advocacy organization community who will be helping us understand how nonprofits like yours can increase their LGBT donor base and board of directors. We are just so happy to have all you here with us today and joining. It's going to be a really exciting conversation, and we're really looking forward to hearing all of Brian's expertise and insights. We'd love to hear as everyone continues to roll in where you are Zooming from today. We are on the panelist side, we're representing the East Coast, so we'd love to know if others of you are with us from different time zones. Before we dive into our exciting discussion, a couple of housekeeping items. We are starting with welcome and intros, and then we're going to lay the foundation in part one by talking about the LGBTQ history and background that will help inform our discussion around some of the more practical in terms of increasing LGBTQ donors and board members. And then finally, like always in Givebutter webinars, we're going to end with a live Q&A section. So please be sure to leave any of your questions in the Q&A feature if you want to make sure that Brian gets to those, not necessarily the chat. However, please do keep using the chat because we love feedback and conversation at Givebutter. So welcome, Christina, Amy, thank you so much for representing. We're excited to have all of you here with us. Givebutter, we're not shy about our emoji and pun use, so this is also completely and totally welcome in this safe space of the chat today. We also have Kate here with us from Givebutter's Customer Success, who's here to answer any and all of your Givebutter specific questions. So if you're inspired by our practical tips and tricks at the end, and you're wondering, well, what does that look like in Givebutter? How do I do that? Feel free to reach out to Kate. And Kate, thank you so much for being here with us today and helping out. If you're wondering how to keep the conversation going after today's webinar with us as panelists or one another in the Givebutter fundraising community, the Givebutter private Facebook group is the perfect place to go. Comment why if you're already in the group. And if you have no clue what I'm talking about, like I said, it's a private Facebook group where there are over 500 fundraisers just like you who are continuing conversations after webinars, asking each other questions about how to get the most out of the platform, sharing their inspiring fundraising successes and challenges along the way. So it would be a great place to join to keep the convo going after we finish at 3 o'clock today. Like I said, I'm your host, Rachel, and streaming to you from Kalamazoo with Givebutter's Marketing. Since I was 16, I've been on a mission to help others. And for over a decade, I've been working with all kinds of nonprofits, mostly large nonprofits that serve kids like United Way, World Vision, Big Brothers, Big Sisters in communities and schools. And fun fact, if you don't know this about me, I'm also a passionate mental health advocate and a limited licensed professional counselor. And I would love to connect with you after today's webinar. So feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, Rachel Mills CMP, or if you want to talk all things Givebutter, please email rachel@givebutter.com. I'd love to know more about all of you on today's webinar. What nonprofits are you representing? What good causes are you working with? I would love to know a little bit more about you as well. And speaking of Givebutter, if you're not familiar, Givebutter is the world's leading online fundraising platform, powering over $100 million per year for over 35,000 good causes like yours to help them raise more, pay less, and give better. Hence the name Givebutter. Givebutter simply means a better way to give. And what's better about Givebutter, in my personal opinion, is that it's free, it's easy to use, and it's just downright fun. If even just looking at the screenshot here, you can get an idea of just how beautiful the user interface is and how fun it is to engage with donors and supporters on the platform. If you're looking to get started today, give it a try for free, just go to givebutter.com. But enough about me and Givebutter. Who you're all here for today is Brian, our incredible guest panelist. Brian is based in New York. He is the external relations manager of Right to Play, a consultant with Parkes Philanthropy. Previously, he was the sales and digital marketing manager for the New York Empire, a tennis team competing in the World Team Tennis League. Brian began his career as a copywriter for a digital marketing firm before moving into the nonprofit space as a founding employee of Athlete Ally, working with allies to advocate for LGBT equality in sports, and so much more. So Brian, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm glad to be here.
Excited to dive in. So like I said, everybody, we're going to be doing a two-part panelist discussion, really just open conversation between Brian and I and everybody else in the chat. Of course, we want to hear what you're all thinking as we discuss, but we're going to start by talking about at a foundational level, LGBTQ history. That's going to inform some of the more practicals that hopefully you'll all get to take away and carry into your organizations to raise more funds, create a more inclusive fundraising community for donors and board members. So starting with this foundational level before getting into specifics, tell us more. What should we know about the LGBT community at its foundation before we even begin talking about fundraising?
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. So I wanted to have us take a little step back as we are getting started here, just to get some context on recent history of the LGBTQ plus community and how sort of social movements and cultural progress affects how you can fundraise through LGBTQ people, and sort of the mechanism by which you do so and the information you're sort of sitting upon that can inform your decision-making process, whether it is in the language you're using or inclusivity for LGBTQ plus employees, I wanted to just kind of give us a little bit of background, some things that are still very relevant, even though we've come so far in the past 10 years as far as sort of acceptance and integration of LGBTQ folks into culture and society and mass media and things like that. There's still a lot of concepts and some hard truth that I think is very much still relevant for some members of the community more than others. So just to give a little bit of um, sort of financial information to this, kind of like the buying power of the LGBTQ plus community is something that is often discussed around this period of the year. So June is Pride Month, right? And we see a lot of companies that have nothing really to do with the LGBTQ community putting a rainbow in their logo. It's good. I think it's a good thing for the general outward acceptance of members of the LGBT community broadly, right? Like it's good that we see corporate America sort of at least outwardly embracing LGBTQ plus people in their marketing schemes. Now, whether or not they're giving to anti-gay politicians, it's another story, right? So like that's one sort of aspect here. But so the buying power of the community is sort of estimated around $3.5 to $3.7 trillion annually. That's a lot of money. That's a lot. That's a larger economy than many countries. So clearly, there's a lot of opportunity in there. But it's also important to recognize that it's a large tent, right? So similar to maybe what some would describe the Democratic Party as. There's like these vast swaths in the community that are underrepresented in all these kinds of studies that are undertaken, that don't have this kind of buying power, that are still sort of in a place where they're not safe in their day-to-day life, particularly trans people of color. So I think that's really important to recognize. And, you know, as I mentioned, over the past 8 to 10 years, when marriage equality was won, there's been a shift in the conversation. I think some folks from the outside looking in would assume that that kind of checked a box for the gay community and how what they consider as pertinent in their civil rights, in their day-to-day life, but there's a lot of work to do yet. So for example, there are 29 states that still allow discrimination against LGBTQ plus people when it comes to housing or employment. That's where a lot of these funds that were previously being directed towards marriage equality efforts have been diverted to. So we'll get deeper later into some of the large funders that fund this kind of work. But that's another important thing to recognize, along with the fact that 33 states have bills introduced limiting the rights of transgender people in the country. Coming from the LGBT fundraising space, having worked with a lot of these policymakers, funders, high net worth individual donors, foundations that in the sports space, it's a particular sort of watershed moment right now where a lot of states have laws on the table that would limit the participation of trans folks in sports. It's a very hot button issue. It's one of the culture wars that has been taken up by the mass media and gets a lot of sort of attention. And we can talk more about that later. I was mentioning to Rachel that I do want folks to feel comfortable asking questions during this space. And even if you feel as though they may be silly or like, I should know this, but I don't, you should just ask, because this is why we're doing this webinar, right? And then globally, the picture is quite different. So there's about 70 countries in the world that have laws that criminalize any LGBTQ plus behavior. There are, various iterations of these types of laws, but globally is another sort of funding diversion from the marriage question to, say, to Russia, to Uganda, to places that have really horrible LGBTQ plus records, is where some of the large foundations have started to fund the advocates and the workers on the ground. So I'm going to pause there, let Rachel interject before we go into sort of a few more areas.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing all of that, Brian. It's super helpful to just kind of pull back and get a big picture. History is so important to recognize, acknowledge, to build empathy, and to understand when we begin to look inward at our own organizations, how that should be impacting, which made me think we've kind of like talked about this a little bit, but when organizations, nonprofits start to look inwardly after thinking about some of this, where should they first look?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this is a question that a lot of organizations that I work for and have worked with have started to ask in a more substantive way, particularly over the past 12 to 18 months, as we've been, kind of in our homes, witnessing, a larger civil rights movement in the US in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement and, anti-Black racism in the US, more recently a focus on the anti-AAPI racism that's cropped up in our country. A great place to start for organizations as they look inwardly is to sort of evaluate if your organization is a safe space for LGBTQ people to be out at work. Do you have staff members that have come out? Do you have any sort of policy within your hiring practices that protect that right for folks? I think an even easier way and a more practical way than sort of that in-depth conversation is to say, list your pronouns in your email signature. That is a step that the organization I work for took about a year and a half ago, mandating that everyone list their gender pronouns in the preferred gender pronouns within their email signature. For some folks, that's not the easiest concept to wrap your head around, gender identity. But listing your gender identity in an outward way, as in your email signature or on your LinkedIn, on your Instagram, is a great way to show folks that you've thought about this, that you want to make people with gender identities outside of the binary, which we're typically operating in, that you want them to feel included in your process as well. So that, for me, would be, I list my pronouns as he and him. And anyone feel free to enter the chat or ask some questions here if you have them. I think it's been a topic that's probably discussed frequently in sort of HR circles, in nonprofit space, certainly the LGBTQ space. But that's a great place to start. And so, from there too, with that same sort of process of internal introspection with whether or not your employees feel comfortable being out at work, what sort of reporting processes are in place from that HR lens? If folks have experienced some sort of discrimination at work additionally. That is another good place to look for, the mechanisms within your organization that would allow people to be comfortable being out at work and know that if they experience discrimination, they have a place to go. A safe, in my perspective, it should be an anonymous reporting tool. And there are lots of free tools and resources that you can access about the best kind of policy to incorporate into your official HR documents. In that regard, we've just been going through all of these at Right to Play, where I work. It's a large, very global, NGO organization that encompasses staff in, almost 30 countries. So if we can do it, I think most folks can do it. yeah, I see some folks asking for some resources in the chat. We can find something like that. Um, I think another sort of tip I would give to sort of management level folks is, don't be afraid to try, even if you don't know exactly what you're doing or saying. Just sort of giving your younger employees or your employees who are LGBTQ the sense that you want to make the environment as inclusive and safe for them as possible. You may misstep, you may misspeak, you may offend some people, but if your intention is good, that will carry across from my perspective and from my experience.
Yeah,
And I'll just
that's so helpful. It's so helpful because part of what you're doing and talking about is like creating an inclusive and safe environment for the LGBT folks at all of our organizations before we start inviting more people to the fold, meaning like donors and board members into our own communities at our nonprofit organizations. It's first starting within and looking inward, which makes so much sense. It's like, how can you skip that step and just jump right into fundraisers and board of directors, right? You've already kind of touched on this a little bit, but I think folks would love to know what's been your experience um, serving in this space. We already went, high level your background, but tell us a little bit more about how that's informed your perspective of creating inclusive fundraising communities.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'll kind of start with, I want to touch quickly too that, sort of our culture moved from sort of the 80s where the AIDS crisis was kind of, dominating the fundraising space in the LGBTQ sort of, landscape where the funds were most directly needed there, and they're still needed there. But from that point forward, it kind of moved into, um, promoting the idea that people can be out at work, including in sports, and in the boardroom, and in, the society in general. So I started in 2012. I was a college senior at the time, and I was an out. I was the captain of the tennis team of the college. I went to a little school called St. Michael's College, and I was out and sort of wrote this piece for a publication that got me introduced to a gentleman by the name of Hudson Taylor, who's a Division I wrestler at Maryland. Had started an organization called Athlete Ally, which was kind of centered on utilizing professional athletes as change makers, which over the course of history in the US has been, an amazing way to advocate for positive social change. I think you probably can remember folks like Jesse Owens, Muhammad Ali,
Mhm.
um, using their platforms to create change. And so that's where I was kind of introduced into the LGBT fundraising space. So we had a great board with some, good contacts that kind of got us involved with a bunch of professional football players, notably Chris Cluey, who was a kicker on the Vikings at the time, and then a gentleman by the name of Brendan Iambadejo, who was on the Baltimore Ravens. And we had sort of helped them place op-eds. One was in Baltimore, one was in Minnesota, about their support of marriage equality. And once we got a few of these men, because women have been long leading the LGBTQ plus revolution, I'll call it, namely, Martina Navratilova and Billie Jean King in the tennis space. Once the men started paying attention and speaking publicly, the tide started to change. So when we first started fundraising with foundations primarily and individuals, the group was primarily all gay folks. So we didn't have a ton of high net worth individuals who were supporting the organization that were in the ally space, and that was kind of one of the main mandates of what we had to do. We had to, you have to find the money outside of direct groups that it was going to, that the change was going to be affecting directly. And, you know, with media coverage and with the provision of sport being sort of a universal language, that's how we were able to kind of make some headway into the right sort of communities and business circles that allowed the organization to grow. And it's still doing well and growing today. And so, yeah, working with kind of that high net worth group in the LGBT community, you do realize that, you know, it's a small circle. And particularly in New York, it's a small circle. And so as we take this conversation towards board members, you know, sort of the behind the scenes networking really is where, from my perspective, you'll find, you know, the most bang for your buck as far as your time and energy are concerned. So it's sort of just your standard connection mapping, reaching out for sort of informational calls with folks who are on the boards of LGBT focused organizations, starting to develop a network that includes people of that ilk, is kind of the main advice I would give as far as searching for those board connections. Yeah, what else am I leaving out here, Rachel?
I guess I'm just wondering, you have all this incredible experience. You just mentioned kind of behind the scenes conversations. Are there other um, takeaways, I guess, from that experience that at like a foundational level kind of inform like your thinking around um, organizations creating more inclusive environments for the LGBT community?
Yeah, I think one of the things to keep in mind is if your organization has a priority to recruit a new board member who is a member of the LGBT community, or you want to recruit a new swath of X number of mass market donors that you know, will help you diversify your mass market portfolio. The one thing to remember to me is that members of the LGBT community who are, you know, I'd say millennials and most members of Gen Z and even up through the age groups, they're try not to pander. I think if you are not an organization that has any direct relation to the LGBT community, slapping a rainbow on it isn't really going to cut it for folks these days, just given where we've come from, right? So like the bar has been raised, particularly over the past 8 to 10 years with representation in the media and sort of the commodification of pride, right? I think you see
Mhm.
over you know, the month of June, the pride campaigns, which again have their value and have their place, but I don't think they replace a sort of fully thought out strategy that
Mhm.
would really attract donors to your organization that aren't attracted to your organization based on the great work you do already, right?
Mhm.
So like the community itself, it isn't a monolith. There are affluent white people, there are, you know, trans women of color that are still looking for safety in their own communities.
Mhm.
There are all kinds of everything in between there. It's not a monolith, you know what I mean? So I
Yeah.
think keeping
Yeah.
that in mind when you're, you know, sort of marketing to a group like this is, it's tricky. And there isn't, you know, even in research for this presentation per se, it, there isn't a ton of great data out there, as far as like what's going to surefire work for, say, a campaign that you're running. It's going to, you know, be some trial and error, especially if you're, say, doing an ad spend with an influencer that has a large LGBT following. Something like that, you know, is going to be kind of a good place to start if you're really looking for a base of LGBT support, whether that means donors, whether that means new followers on social, whether that means new subscribers, website visitors, however you're defining that metric. You know, doing some research into the audience segment that you're looking for and how your organization would fit into that segment is a great place to start, I think. And then, you're going to need a little bit of budget if it really is an organizational priority, whether that means ad spend or, allocating staff time to create specific campaigns or materials. That should all factor into your planning process for sure.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I know Kyson, awesome question here. We're gonna hold on that and come back when we get to part two when we're talking about some of the more practical. So we hear you, Kyson. This is a really good question. Um, Thinking about we've, kind of been throwing out making a more inclusive fundraising community. What does that mean though? How would you define creating an inclusive fundraising community?
Yeah, I think, I'll take us back a step to the environment that your folks are working in. So are your fundraisers people who are inclusive in their own lives of members of the LGBTQ community, right? So like, are they people that you would be comfortable, if I'm an executive director and I have a major gifts officer, going to meet with a gay donor? Are you comfortable with them having that conversation? I think a lot of the inclusivity part comes down to your staffing and the culture that you've created within your organization or your institution. So yeah, I mean, like, from the perspective of someone who is a member of the community, you want to see that the organization has at least some self-awareness to it when it comes to who they're hiring, the types of people who comprise their board, the types of organizations that are represented on their board. That definitely matters as far as creating that sort of inclusive community. And then when you are perhaps marketing to your mass market list, are you including language that is perhaps gender neutral, or flipping out words like husband and wife if you're marketing to couples, for terms like partner or spouse, to make it more inclusive in that regard. Again, the pronouns in your email signatures is the big one that people notice. Yeah, I'd say that it starts internally, and then if you are going to do some external activations, be it with other brands that are partners or other organizations, just making sure the content that you're promoting is LGBT friendly. And if you don't have a sort of folks on your staff that are kind of well ensconced in that community, then makes a good sense to kind of ask around.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So again, that perspective of like inward, outward, doing that internal work that needs to happen first. Yeah, so helpful. And then before we move on to some more of the practicals, wondering if there's anything else in terms of the history of fundraising around the LGBT community, anything else that you think would be helpful for people to know?
Just that it was in 2003 when Massachusetts became the first state to legalize same-sex unions. And around that point in time, LGBT issues were receiving about 32 million annually from US foundations. And by 2012, that had sort of quadrupled to about 120 million a year. So most of this money was going to civil issues. It has obviously since then kind of shifted a bit to kind of healthcare related issues. Then we come down to the sort of more social issues like the bullying, homelessness among LGBT and particularly trans youth,
Mhm.
and then other obstacles that kind of are facing LGBTQ folks later in life, like retirement, estate planning, things like that there's been barriers to over the course of the history of our country, that necessitate some services provided by organizations, particularly for folks of this community. And the funders in this arena are sort of the Parkes Foundation has been doing really substantive work in this area for a long time. The Gill Foundation, the Oak Foundation. There's lots of foundational institutions that have been been there for the long haul. And, some of these marriage organizations like Freedom to Marry, for example, have disbanded and sort of helped place their staff in other areas of the development of the LGBT community. And then, that's speaking domestically. And then when you look at the picture globally, the funding now, kind of has to be shared between, various advocacy efforts in, for example, there's a a lens on Japan right now because of the upcoming Olympics there, and they don't really have any anti-discrimination laws um, within their, say, like workplace federal legislature, I believe. And so, organizations like Human Rights Watch, um, Athlete Ally, there's several others that work in kind of that sports advocacy space that do good work, that are kind of advocating for, these large economy nations that play on the international stage to kind of catch up in this capacity to, you know, what the general consciousness is of the people of that nation.
Yeah, so helpful. Um, Kind of like shifting gears here into part two, taking all this really helpful, beautiful foundation that you've laid, Brian. Nonprofits are uniquely positioned to create inclusive fundraising communities. What would you say are some of the opportunities and challenges that nonprofits have to do so?
Yeah, I think definitely, the segmentation among your marketing materials and your um, and how you're reaching and how you're speaking to different segments of your donors. And it may not even be as much as I see a chat in here about the age ranges between donors
Mhm.
and things like that. It may even be that you're sort of generalizing your terminology and making your marketing materials more inclusive for your younger donors, which may also kind of work for your LGBT donors, because I think um, as the kind of Gen Z millennial crowd step into their early and young career, where they can be your kind of cornerstone mass market folks, or
Mhm.
even your mid-level folks. I think kind of looking at any data you have as far as their age ranges, if you, I doubt you're probably going to know the sexual orientation of many of your mass market donors. But if it's your mid-level folks that you have personal relationships with, or certainly your high net worth individuals, creating a relationship that is open and honest with them, and how your work may or may not be relevant to their you know but to why they give. That's a good sort of bellwether. Make it as inclusive as possible, and with those folks that are high level givers, take the time to sort of recognize that they are a member of the LGBT community. And I mean, as I've said, LGBT folks don't just give to LGBT organizations,
Mhm.
but it doesn't hurt, certainly, when you have at least some self-awareness as an organization, or you have another board member that's a member of the community, or, high-level staff members. That's a good thing to consider. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I know one of the challenges that we've talked about before is, and you've mentioned earlier, is that the data is challenging when it comes to segmentation. We're not thinking and shouldn't be thinking monolith when we think about the LGBT community.
Right.
Um, However, there are some things that we do know that turn folks off, right? Can you mention some of those things that people may not be aware of?
Yeah. Yeah, so it kind of starts with the slapping of the rainbow logo on every June. And I'm not necessarily speaking for, again, the LGBT community as a whole, right? Because no one can do that, because there are many facets, just as there are of any community.
Right.
Uh, I think, we're gay 12 months a year. So you can't just focus on June if it's truly going to be, you know, an organizational priority to make the landscape as inclusive as possible. You're going to want to think of elements of kind of the pandering culture that you'll avoid. I think if you haven't ever celebrated Pride as an organization or done, say, a Pride event with a partner, a Pride event, you know, internally, that's a good place to start. And that may be that may just mean some rainbows for your organization if, as one of the questions came in, if you do have some of that conservative core support, you're going to have to decide if they're segmented out of those communications, if it's worth, you know, one-on-one conversations with the relationship manager, if, you know, it's a risk you're willing to take, if it's a sort of cornerstone funder that, you know, the organization is taking this stance on LGBT issues. And I know nonprofits, many nonprofits tend to sort of lean apolitical based on where the money is coming from, but it's an organizational choice that you have to make. Just deciding what's worth it. Is it one single donor or a few donors, or is it sort of your scruples as an organization? You know, for me, there's a right answer there, but
yeah,
you know, I think everyone's different, and your funding sources are tricky. And you know, this sort of question, particularly on the international level, comes up not just from, you know, sort of an LGBT perspective, but from the perspective of, you know, if you're taking money from hedge funds, what are these hedge funds invested in? And if you're, you know, taking money from, say, the mining industry, but you're working to get children out of early labor, how do you sort of rectify those two competing narratives with your funding sources? And everyone's conversation there is going to be different. But yeah, for LGBT folks, I'd say avoid the pandering by having someone help you if you aren't a member of the community. And if that means, just one other point there that I wanted to kind of raise to be wary of is you have to be careful about asking for free labor from members of a marginalized community, particularly during Pride Month, if you have no idea what to sort of create for a campaign or an external facing communication or activation. It's a theme within the community, particularly among artists, folks who are asked to do events for exposure and things like that. It's just something to, and not everyone feels that way, again, that they should be necessarily compensated financially. There are folks who are in positions to do things for a volunteer basis, like I am here, but it's just something to consider, particularly if you're looking to enlist the services or the design skills of a member of the LGBT community. Consider putting a little budget there.
Yeah, that's a great tip. And speaking of challenges, things to be aware of, Kyson's question was, do you have tips for avoiding tokenization and the involvement of LGBT folks in fundraising efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two ways to kind of look at this. There's from the perspective of, say, language. So if there are a lot of kind of words, phrases, expressions that have kind of come out of the Black trans community that have kind of been adopted by mass media. I think, you know, for an example of a practical sense, like RuPaul's Drag Race has kind of brought that culture to the forefront, you know, bought by a major network. And so kind of these language pieces that have been, quote, like owned and utilized by people of color, and, you know, and particularly trans people of color. If all of a sudden a brand is utilizing that same language and terminology during Pride Month, it's gonna sort of raise a red flag for members of the community who have, you know, been kind of raised on or indoctrinated by this kind of culture outside of the mass media lens. So I think watching the language you're using, and then again, if you're going to do a pride campaign, making sure that there is relevance to the work that you're doing. I think that's a good way to avoid the pandering, is if the work you're doing does benefit the community, or if you are hosting an event, run by one of your board members, and you have an LGBT board member, or you're going to have some drag queens come in and do a bingo with your employees, like taking the temperature of some of the staff that is LGBT, and really kind of getting their honest feedback about it, is another good place to start.
Yeah. What does that sound like? How would you ask that question if you were to take the temperature, for example?
Yeah, I think a good place to start for an organization, again, this is size dependent, but is there like an LGBT sort of working group within the organization? I know Right to Play, where I currently work, does have various kind of workplace affinity groups that folks can be a
Mhm.
part of. We use Facebook Workplace to kind of have different channels where folks from various kind of communities, ethno-religious groups,
Mhm.
people who like outdoor activities and things like that. These
Mhm.
channels where folks can kind of talk amongst themselves and kind of express opinions, share challenges, share wins, just share pieces of their life. Creating that space first, I think, would be a good start. If your organization isn't an organization of that size, maybe it's more of a, making that a priority. If you're a manager with your direct reports, checking in with them about if they're willing to share these details of their personal life. Because I
Mhm.
mean, the tricky thing too there is that not all folks who identify as LGBTQ plus are going to want to share that aspect of their life fully with work.
Mhm.
Um, and there are myriad reasons as to why that may be, but I think the sort of I don't know if affinity groups is even the right term, but sort of the internal
Mhm.
club, working group, whatever it may be, and asking them to kind of help you formulate a plan, and taking their temperature first, and even determining if it would be appropriate for your organization is a good place to go.
Mhm. Great. And then just diving in kind of quickly here, what are practical ways that we haven't touched on yet to help everyone on this call increase their LGBTQ donors?
Yeah, I think you know I have conflicting sort of opinions about influencer marketing in general, but I do think um, influencer marketing, particularly with some influential folks within the LGBT community, is a good place to start. So
Mhm.
you can spend a modest amount with one of these influencers. Particularly popular right now are drag queens, particularly drag queens that have appeared on RuPaul's Drag Race, which is a like wildly popular show now on VH1. I think it used to be on Logo, which is the LGBT network. But so that's a great place to start. We've touched a little bit about kind of the gender neutral partner language if you're targeting mostly couples. Um, you know, there's a lot of sort of, what's the way to put it, questions around like what drives LGBT donors the most. And I think
Mhm.
um, it's not easy, again, to segment that entirely effectively, because there are vast swaths of age ranges and giving capabilities, and
Mhm.
you know propensity to give, and what kind of organizations do these folks give to. So kind of developing your case for support for with an LGBT lens
Mhm.
is another good place to start. And then, if you're going after some more high net worth um, board level type folks, do your LinkedIn mapping, get those sort of introductory calls on your books with kind of some of these well-connected folks that are um, able to hook you up with folks at this caliber, and start developing relationships. I think personal relationships um, is kind of the not so sexy, but definitely most effective way to manage
Mhm.
sort of board recruitment and high net worth individual donor recruitment. Um, but yeah, just developing a good suite of assets that you have at the ready to send these folks when you're ready to pitch them on joining your board or becoming a donor, and making sure those assets are LGBT friendly. I don't think they necessarily need to come with a rainbow cover, but making
Mhm.
sure that they aren't going to put anybody off that you're going after.
Right. Yeah. You already started speaking to board members, doing some of the mapping, having open, honest conversations, doing the internal work. Um, and I'm specifically curious. I know you have a background in copywriting, and there may be some people on the call today who are like, I don't even know where to start if I'm revamping some of my marketing materials or
Yeah.
my year-end appeal that I always send every year. I've never thought about it through this lens. Like, where do I even begin?
Yeah. So, I mean, I was an SEO copywriter for, oddly enough, an automotive marketing firm.
Nice.
um, but so we, had a proprietary tool that would show you um, lagging keywords, right? So keywords that your organization is interested in having rank higher on, say, page one of Google. I would
Mhm,
say set yourself up as to the best of your ability in Google Analytics, and certainly apply for the Google Ads grant.
mhm.
Um,
Yes.
it's not particularly difficult to set up. You have to have an eye on it, but I think most folks who are digital natives, or folks who have kind of become digital natives, could manage one of these grants, and that's a great place to start. That way you can test keywords, you can see where you're ranking, you can see where you need to improve, and then put some content on your site that really tries to hit on those keywords. Everyone's process will be different based on their website capabilities and what sort of CRM you're using. um, but yeah, kind of don't be afraid of Google Analytics would be definitely my advice there, and get yourself that ads grant, because I started to reflexively manage that grant, and we still see results from it. Um, as far as kind of new folks who Google something that you've um, put in your keywords, and they eventually get to you, um, and if you're willing to kind of do a small spend around year end, we typically spend um, to kind of do some retargeting around certain um, types of media, or around particular keywords, or if we're fundraising with an individual. For example, I'm doing a large campaign with Allison Felix right now, who is um, an Olympian that is competing to reach her fifth Olympics, and if she wins a medal, she'll donate her winnings to my organization. So I'm targeting,
Wow.
folks right now that Google her, or
Mhm.
I'll have folks redirected to my page with a website or with an ad on that lands on an article about her that isn't necessarily related to right to play, but that is another good way to kind of drive some web traffic, and look for new donors. And it doesn't have to be a huge spend. You can spend modestly. Um, and I've found pretty decent results with that kind of digital retargeting, display ads, things like that.
Mhm. That's great to hear. And kind of going back on this point about board members and LinkedIn mapping, um, moving here kind of into the Q&A, Jan is wondering, can you elaborate they're unfamiliar? Is premium membership required? Very specific.
I'm not positive. I mean, I think even if you want to kind of avoid the LinkedIn mapping, just go to some of these larger organizations and look who's on their board, look what companies they're at. And then if you aren't connected with them, see if you may have somebody in between that could help connect you with them on the back end. If you aren't as comfortable trolling LinkedIn, I'm pretty comfortable trolling LinkedIn, but or if you have another tool like a donor search or an iWave, something like that, if you kind of come upon some of these folks who are board members of these LGBT organizations, go see where else they're giving, and maybe those boards have potential within their ranks or within their contacts as well. I mean, I think, again, to me here, relationships are kind of everything with the recruitment of board members. And I think also using your own board, I think sometimes board members forget about connections they have. I find that
They
quite a bit,
do. They
that
do.
they forget that they're connected to, the head of this large foundation that we've been pitching for 3 years. Like, oh yeah, I went to college with him. Like, well, that'd be great to know
Right.
prior to this, but making it kind of I don't know, putting some parameters around it for our board members has really helped with, committees and things like that. I think folks like to feel useful, and everybody likes giving advice.
So true.
So, framing the conversations around asking for an opinion rather than an immediate ask for or a board spot is another good way to kind of go about it.
That's a great rule of thumb. So everyone, we're going to spend a few more minutes in live Q&A. So if you have questions for Brian, go ahead and drop those in the Q&A feature or the chat. We'll be looking both places. And feel free to be a little selfish. If you're thinking about a specific scenario in your nonprofit organization or cause related to anything we talked about today, Brian can coach you through it. He can answer that specific question. Or if you just have something general about today's topic that you think would be helpful for everybody on today's call, that would be great. And as we wait, one of my questions is, as people leave today, what would you say are 1 or 2 steps that people could take right after this call, after listening, that you're like, this is just really practical. If you're leaving today, I hope you take away 1 and 2.
Put your pronouns in your bio, in your email signature, and on your LinkedIn, and that sends an immediate signal to external folks that you take this seriously. And that's a good step as well. That's kind of gonna dissuade folks from thinking you're pandering. So take that step. And if you aren't sure about formatting or the best way to do it, or even how you identify, Google is your friend in that regard. And I promise you that is a step that, I've had conversations about that little step with former employers and former, managers that aren't quite sure how they fit in there, or if they should be doing that, or if this is for me. And I promise you, it's for you. You should do that, especially if you're in a management role. It shows at least a lens of inclusivity that you're willing to take on, and it kind of intimates that you're willing to have these conversations. Even, again, probably won't be perfect. You may misstep, you may misspeak with folks, but it's a good first step.
Yes. Number 1, change those, update them. Couple questions that just came in. One from Christina. She says, the nonprofit I support provides services to adults who have intellectual disabilities. There has been little research that she's found to show the connection to the LGBT community and people who have identified. So maybe she's just sharing that with everyone.
Yeah.
Michael.
That data problem.
Yeah.
Tricky.
Yeah. Michael has a question here. What's the best way to approach an LGBTQ board member with an ask?
Well, it depends on if you're sort of doing a soft ask kind of a cold ask, more southern soft ask, or if you're being introduced by somebody. I mean, I always prefer an introduction to a cold ask. But I don't think there would be necessarily any sort of specific formula to follow aside from what you would do for anybody else, except have that knowledge in the back of your mind, so that you are sensitive to that sort of language considerations, and that side of things. I don't think there would be any kind of, you don't need to put a rainbow on it on the
Right.
materials, I'll tell you that. But I think in a case where you're doing a cold ask particularly, I think proceed as normal. And then if you can get an intro, always better. If you have LGBT staff, I don't necessarily think you should put them on that case right away, but you may think about utilizing them as one of the relationship managers if indeed it goes through.
It makes sense. Yeah. Well, Brian, thank you so much again for sharing all of your expertise with us today. This was incredible. Let's hear it in the chat, everybody, for Brian. Amazing. Thank you for joining us. And if you're looking to connect with Brian after today's call, you can reach out to him on Twitter. You can shoot him an email here. We also have his LinkedIn and connection with Parkes Philanthropy, our verified partner that we mentioned before. And as always, we're going to send the slides and recording after today's webinar, so you can find all this contact info saved there. We're going to pull up a quick poll to get some feedback from you today. We'd love to know what you thought of today's webinar. And as always, thank you for joining for another Givebutter webinar, everybody. We'd love to connect with you afterward, and we hope we see you in July for our next webinar on planned giving. So until then, we hope you have a great rest of your month and happy fundraising, everybody. Goodbye.
Thanks, Rachel.
Bye, everybody.